Eid is over. The prayers have been prayed, the sacrifice has been made, the family gathered, the food was good. And there's a specific feeling that some Muslims experience the days after Eid that nobody really talks about. It's not sadness exactly, more like a quiet emptiness, right? Like the spiritual high of Arafah and Eid has faded, and ordinary life has rushed back in, and you're not sure how to carry what you felt in the last few days into what comes next. If that's where you are today, this video is for you, because Islam has a very specific answer for what that feeling is, where it comes from, and what to do with it. If this kind of content is useful to you, subscribe now. It genuinely helps me keep making it, and you won't miss what's coming next. Now let's get into it. So there's a very specific emotional pattern that many Muslims experience around this time of year. The day of Arafah feels intense. There's dua, fasting, a sense of nearness to Allah that's hard to describe. Then comes Eid morning, the salah, the takbir, the joy, the sense of gratitude and connection. For many people, there's a real spiritual high in those moments. But then, quietly, life returns to normal. Work resumes, routines resume, the atmosphere changes again. And what often follows is not just a return to routine, but a sense of guilt. Many Muslims think, if my Iman was stronger, shouldn't this feeling last? Why does my heart feel elevated one day and ordinary the next? Does this mean something's wrong with my faith? And so the emotional contrast becomes a spiritual concern. But the question is this experience actually a sign of weak Iman? Or is it something the Islamic tradition already understands and explains explicitly? And explains directly. Directly was the right word. The Prophet ﷺ said, Iman increases and decreases. That statement's not a warning. It's just a description of how Iman works by design. Scholars explain that Iman naturally rises in response to acts of worship, moments of closeness to Allah, hearing the Quran, being in prayer, being in community, and it naturally contracts in the absence of those inputs. Dhul Hijjah is the most intense period of Islamic worship in the entire year. The fasting of Arafah, the dhikr, the Eid prayer, the Qurbani, the communal remembrance of Ibrahim alayhi salam. Your Iman was being fed from every direction. Right now those specific inputs have stopped. The contraction you feel isn't some kind of failure, it's physics. It's Iman working exactly the way the Prophet ﷺ described. What you're experiencing is actually something the scholars understood very clearly. Our scholarly tradition has described the heart in a very simple way. Some have compared it to a plant, right? When a plant is given water, it becomes green, alive, and open. When the water is reduced, it doesn't mean that the plant's going to die off immediately. It simply means the condition that was sustaining that growth is no longer present with the same intensity. And the same principle applies to the heart. Spiritual moments like Arafah and Eid morning are not just emotional experiences. They're moments where the heart is being watered, so to speak, with remembrance, with community, with heightened awareness, with reduced distraction. So when those conditions change, the internal state naturally changes as well. And that change isn't a verdict on your Iman. It's just a signal, not a judgment. Okay, a signal that says, this is what your heart responds to. And scholars emphasize something very important here. The correct response to this kind of spiritual contraction is not to force the feeling back artificially. It's not to try to recreate the emotional peak of Arafah in everyday life. Rather, it's to identify what was feeding the heart in those moments, and then find sustainable ways to bring those elements into ordinary life. Smaller, more consistent, less intense, but continuous. Because Iman is not meant to exist only in peaks. It's meant to be sustained in a steady, lived form. And the goal isn't to live from one spiritual high to another, but to learn what keeps the heart alive in between them. But here's the more important question. What is Dhul Hijjah supposed to leave behind? Not the feeling. The feeling was always going to pass. Something more permanent. Scholars say that every major Islamic season, Ramadan, Dhul Hijjah, right, is designed to install something in the believer that survives the season itself. The question is what Dhul Hijjah specifically was meant to install. The scholars explain that the central lesson of Dhul Hijjah is not emotional intensity. It's submission. The entire season revolves around the story of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam and his readiness to give everything for the sake of Allah. So what's meant to remain after Eid is not the emotional peak, not the intensity of Arafah, not the spiritual atmosphere of Eid morning. Those naturally come and go. What's meant to remain is something deeper, a more stable willingness to submit to Allah in everyday life. That's the real outcome that scholars point to. This is why they say the post-Eid period is not an end. It's a moment of reflection, a moment to ask, what actually changed in me during these days? Did Dhul Hijjah simply pass as a series of rituals? Or did it leave behind a question in my heart about what I'm still holding on to, about what my Ismail is in this stage of my life? And scholars also note something important here, that the post-Eid emptiness many people feel isn't necessarily negative. It can actually be productive. Because when the emotional intensity settles, it creates space for honesty, space to assess, space to ask whether anything internal shifted, or whether the season passed without leaving a trace in the heart. So rather than rushing to recreate the feeling, the believer is invited to reflect on what remains when the feeling is gone. Every Islamic season comes to an end. Ramadan ends, Dhul Hijjah ends. Even the most spiritually intense moments don't remain permanently, not at the same level. And the scholars are very clear that this is not the problem. Because the goal was never to live in a constant state of peak emotion. The goal is to ask something more grounded. What has actually been installed in me during this time? What remains when the atmosphere changes? What stays when the intensity fades? When you look at the lives of the companions, they weren't living in permanent spiritual highs. The Prophet ﷺ and his companions had moments of intense worship, reflection, and sacrifice. But their daily lives were still ordinary in structure. They had work, family, responsibility, routine. What distinguished them was not constant emotional intensity, but consistent practice and stable submission. The seasons of worship functioned more like catalysts. They intensified the heart. They realigned it. They awakened something. But they were never meant to be the entire structure of the believer's life. And this is why the feeling many people experience after Eid can be so unsettling. That sense of emptiness is not a sign that something went wrong. It's the feeling of scaffolding being removed. During Dhul Hijjah, there was structure around the heart. Fasting, dua, community, heightened awareness. Then suddenly that structure's gone. And what remains is the important question. Was there something built underneath it? Or was the structure itself mistaken for the building? Because the purpose of these seasons was never to replace ordinary life. It was to shape what ordinary life becomes afterwards. So what do you actually do with this after Eid? First, name what changed. Before you move on, ask yourself one honest question. What specific thing is different in my relationship with Allah after these days? Not how I felt, not how emotional it was, but what's actually different? And if the answer is nothing, that's not something to panic about, but it's information worth sitting with, because it tells you where attention is needed next. Second, carry one practice forward. Don't try to keep everything, right? Take one thing from Dhul Hijjah and make it permanent. It could be the daily takbir, or a consistent charity habit, or fasting Mondays and Thursdays, right? Just one, something small enough to survive ordinary life, because the goal is not seasonal worship, it's continuity. Third, direct the feeling you're experiencing. That emptiness many people feel after Eid is often Iman looking for something to attach to. So give it something real. Open the Quran, one page, right? Not to feel something dramatic, but to give the heart input again, because Iman responds to what it's fed. And finally, carry forward the deeper question. Ask yourself again, what is my Ismail? Because that question doesn't belong only to Eid. It's not tied to a season. It's the question of everyday life. What am I holding on to so tightly that I need to keep remembering where it stands in relation to Allah? And if you keep that question alive, then Dhul Hijjah doesn't end when the calendar moves on. It continues in how you live afterwards. Now the key thing to understand is this. The feeling after Eid is not the end of something. It's the beginning of something. Dhul Hijjah was the catalyst. What comes after it is where the real work is. The Ibrahim alayhi salam that Allah loved, not the one who was willing for one dramatic moment. It was the one who lived his entire life in a posture of submission, day by day, in the ordinary and the extraordinary equally. That's what Eid al-Adha is inviting you toward. Not the feeling, the posture. You felt something this week. Now let it change something permanently. If this helps you process what you're feeling after Eid, subscribe. And share this with a Muslim who's sitting with that quiet emptiness today. This might be exactly what they needed to hear.